Welcome. My name is Christine Commerce. I'm the program director for the Alliance to End Human Trafficking. Thank you so much for being here and part of our training for our newest Speakers Bureau. So today we're going to go over our HT 101 presentation. I know a lot of you are already aware of this issue and are well versed in human trafficking. But the point of this presentation is just to share some tips and talking points that our organization will be presenting during this presentation. But please feel free to make it your own. Our other presentations are based a lot on this as a basis for our other presentations. So this is going to be a good, say, beginning ground for those who will be joining our Speakers Bureau. So with this slide, I usually would ask my audience, especially if it's a live audience, what they're hoping to gain from this presentation. You may ask what they think of when they hear of the term human trafficking and where is it happening. So I may ask how many people have seen the movie Taken and how many people think of human trafficking as someone being kidnapped off the streets or in their nearby Target or shopping center. So here we want to introduce a little bit more about the organization, and you could also share a personal story if you like on how this issue affects you. So I like to begin by, what other people sometimes assume or think that we would do, right? So they may think we're out there rescuing survivors or that we provide direct services, when in fact our mission is mostly focused on education and awareness. So this is what I like to think I do, right? I'm out there fighting for justice. I'm helping those who are less fortunate and the most vulnerable. And then here's what we actually do. So we do presentations, we do education and outreach events. We also do advocacy as well as work with our advocacy working group. And in addition to that, we do have member houses that we help support by giving grant or scholarships and help funding with some of their member houses so their survivors can go on to earn an education or possibly a college degree. So with this slide, we want to take a moment and not necessarily compare human trafficking of today with slavery of the past, but just to bring to light that oftentimes when we think of human trafficking, it's often referred to as modern day slavery. And so there was some consideration whether to leave this out of our presentation or not, but after conferring with a couple of our survivor advisory council members, they decided that it is important to keep in here. But with that caveat, we want to make sure that we present this in a very mindful way. So we want to be very cognizant of who our target audience is, because we definitely don't want to offend anyone. Obviously, slavery of the past targeted a very specific ethnic group. And so when we talk about American history and slavery, which was supposed to end with the Emancipation Proclamation, we're talking about people who were shackled, and they were all African American or Black. And those are the people that we see in slavery of the past. What we see with what is called modern day slavery, but our organization focuses on the term human trafficking, is that human trafficking can happen to anyone, any age, race, religion, socioeconomic background. And we may not see those chains and shackles like we did so many years ago. And yet there's more people in this situation than there were during the transatlantic slave trade when it was legal. So it's illegal in every single country around the world. And yet, in every single country around the world, it is still practiced. So in other countries, there are situations where they're very much maybe chained up or held against their will and so forth. A lot of human trafficking survivors or victims don't identify with that term, modern day slavery, which is why we're trying to get away from it. But there are some cases where that can happen here as well. Frederick Douglass once said that slavery is the pathway, or knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom. So that is our goal. We want to educate people and inspire people and inspire them to take action. So first, we'd like to clear up any misconceptions. So when we think of human trafficking, some people may think it's illegal prostitution for money, that the victims are only girls. This is not happening where I live or in my communities. I know what those pimps look like, right? They're the ones that like in the Halloween costume with the big purple hat and the feather and the big gold chains and the gold tooth. I don't know anyone who is a victim. Traffickers only target migrants, maybe people who are poor, people living in other countries or from other countries. And I don't necessarily need to be involved with this because this is not really impacting anyone I know or in my neighborhoods. So you can share a personal story as well, if you like, on how this impacts you. For example, when I did a presentation in my diocese with the Catholic school principals, I asked at the beginning of the presentation, how many of you think that human trafficking could happen to any of your students? And only a couple people raised their hand out of over 60 people. After I was done with my presentation, I then asked, now how many of you think this can happen to your students? And almost all of them raised their hands, but there were still a couple that did not. And I heard someone comment, well, they have money. So I can tell you, I grew up in a Catholic family, went to Catholic school. My parents didn't have a lot of money, but they had some enough, where we could go to private school and so forth. And I know of other students or survivors that went to Catholic school or came from upper middle class Catholic family. And yes, they were trafficked. So that just goes to show that it can really happen to anyone. And it doesn't really matter if you're poor, rich, poor, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, happens to all different races, happens to all different religions. And it happens, it doesn't matter your socioeconomic background and so forth. So this is the legal definition of human trafficking. So we want to emphasize the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Because if you are a victim 18 years and older, you do have to prove that force, fraud, or coercion. So with that force, we're talking about, yes, maybe some of those kidnappings or that physical restraint, that physical harm, sexual assault, beatings, confinement. And this often happens in the very early stages of victimization. But then the fraud includes false promises regarding employment, wages, working conditions, love, marriage, or a better life. Over time, there's an unexpected change in those circumstances, and it could be in their compensation, that debt agreement, or the nature of the relationship. And then there's also the coercion. So coercion is more of the threats. And that includes threats of serious harm or physical restraint against any person. It could be psychological intimidation, document confiscation, and that shame and fear-inducing threats to share information or pictures with others or report to authorities. Now, it is important to note that minors who are under the age of 18 do not need to prove that force, fraud, or coercion. So if anything of value is being traded for those sex acts, they're automatically considered a victim of human trafficking. And this is often referred to as a crime against God-given basic human rights and dignity. So depending on how much time you have for your presentation, we do have a little breakdown or summary of each of these different types of trafficking around the world. If you have limited time, what you could do is maybe just mention a few of them. One thing I do like to point out is that forced marriage and child marriage, while we may picture that happening around the world, it is still happening here in the United States, and child marriage is still legal in many states in our country. So this is a $150 billion world market. It is the fastest growing criminal industry in the world. It is second only to illegal drugs and recently passed the illegal gun trade. So statistics vary oftentimes because there are no great statistics out there when it comes to human trafficking. So according to the US Department of State, there are 27.9 million people in labor and sex trafficking, which is what we're going to focus on today. But according to the International Labor Organization and the Global Slavery Index, that number is high as 50 million, with 22 million enforced marriages. So the US Department of State does not consider forced marriage as a form of human trafficking. So here you could possibly share some local stats as well. For me, Florida ranks third in the nation for the number of calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And Greater Orlando, where I lived, ranks second in the state. And while most of the profits are made from the sexual exploitation industry, most of the victims are in forced labor. So why is it done? So here we want to talk a little bit about the traffickers and their need for control, for greed, for power, for wealth. This is a $32 billion industry in the United States. And because there is such a low risk for traffickers and the chances of getting caught, this is what makes it such a growing criminal enterprise. But it's also due in part because of the consumer. For prostitutes and child victims, for pornography, and because we want cheaper products. So we're not going to show every video here today. I'm going to allow you to do that on your own time. But what you want to do is, depending on the length of presentation that you have or the time that you have, you want to go through and maybe pick and choose which videos would best suit your audience. If you have a full hour, great. You could probably show every single video in this presentation. If not, then you're going to have to pick and choose which presentations or which videos you can show in your presentation to allow for that time. Once again, you can go into some examples of some of the victims and the types of workers that you see here. So for me, there was a big bust against some massage workers and massage parlors on the Space Coast of Florida. This made national news because one of the perpetrators who was arrested was Robert Kraft, the New England Patriots owner. Now, he was found not guilty, but unfortunately, the workers and the victims in that situation were arrested. So you have to understand, when these women are coming over from Asia, probably promised a certain job, and then they find themselves trapped here in very much different working conditions. But there's also a different cultural mindset. They're taught to fear law enforcement. Their families may be threatened back home. They don't want to shame their families. So they may have their trafficker who knows where they live back home, where their family lives, and they may say to them, if you talk to law enforcement, we're going to do this to your little sister. We are going to kill your parents. So oftentimes they are afraid to talk to law enforcement, and then they don't get the services that they so much need. Farm workers here in Florida, we have a webinar called Slavery in Our Tomatoes. I suggest you check it out. It's very eye-opening on what is happening with labor trafficking and labor exploitation of our agricultural workers. So in this particular instance, these workers sometimes were being sexually abused or raped in the fields. They were being beaten. In some cases, they were under guard with guns. They weren't allowed to take water breaks. If they did, they would get beaten. And so if they did report, the supervisor would tell them, you know, if you report me, I'll go and pay my fine, but I'll just come back and beat you the next day. So then they started getting the Catholic Church involved, and then they started doing a 30-day hunger strike. And the coalition of Immokalee workers started to make changes in a program that's not called the Fair Food Program. So there's lots of different examples of how labor exploitation happens within our different industries right here in the United States, even with our children. We may picture that little boy or that little girl over in India making rugs. What we don't picture is some of our children here working in meatpacking plants, also in the agricultural industry. And what happens here in Central Florida is that we have kids that are going door to door under the guise of a fundraiser, selling trinkets or candy bars from the dollar store, and they're being put in very dangerous situations. Then we also have modeling. So some traffickers will use that to lure young girls into pornography or human trafficking as well, as we saw in the case of Jeffrey Epstein. And then even exotic dancers. So there was a single mom here in Central Florida who had a special needs daughter. She wanted to go to law school, and to make ends meet, she became an exotic dancer. From there, she was told that she was going to have to start selling herself for sex. And when she refused, she was gang raped and found herself sex trafficked for 2 years. So at this point, I may ask my audience to raise their hand if they have human trafficking victims working for them. I get about one, maybe two people who may raise their hand. And then I may ask them, raise your hand if you own a cell phone. Do you eat chocolate, seafood, drink coffee, buy clothing, get your nails done? Most likely, you have human trafficking victims working for you. So you can go on slaveryfootprint.org. I had over 60 people working for me. So as consumers, we often want cheaper products. And this is not always just as simple as, oops, sorry, let me go back. This is not always as simple as buying fair trade, but we can also contact companies and let them know that, yes, this issue is important to me. And yes, we can support fair trade and direct trade companies. And I think of it this way. David took 5 stones to defeat Goliath. And so because it's such a huge problem, I always tell people, pick 5 products and change the way that you purchase your products. So for example, in the seafood industry, men and boys are lured in Indonesia and Ghana with, promises of a job. But then they find themselves trapped on these ships, working 12 to 14 hours a day with little or no pay. If they complain, they're beaten or thrown overboard. Some are imprisoned on ships for years at a time or held captive on islands with no way to escape. So we also have another webinar that talks a little bit about fishermen in this industry, and it's conducted by an AP Associated Press reporter who really did a lot of investigative work on this issue and really brought to light really all the slavery that's happening in our seafood industry. The other example I like to share is the cocoa industry and what's happening with the child laborers and the west coast of Africa. So according to the US Department of Labor, there is an estimated 1.5 million children working in the cocoa industry. Many of them are forced to work on these West African cocoa farms. But these numbers have faces. The faces of a little boy who was lured away with the simple promise of a bicycle. He found himself enslaved on a cocoa plantation, given nothing but bananas and yams to eat, worked 12 hours a day, slept on a black tarp, and so he never even got to taste the chocolate that he worked so hard for. One former cocoa slave and told that reporters that beatings were a part of his life. When a reporter asked Drisa, another recently freed child laborer, what he would tell people who eat chocolate from slave labor, he said, tell them that they enjoyed something I suffered to make. Tell them that they're eating my flesh. So, buying fair trade chocolate and locally sourced seafood, we can make our voices heard through our purchasing choices. And by contacting our favorite companies, we can let them know that this issue is important to us and we need them to address slavery in their supply chains. So I always encourage people to take out their phones at this point. They can download what is called the Sweat and Toil app by iLab. And it's the first step for awareness in which countries are using child labor or forced child labor. And then boycott is another way you can scan certain products as well. And there's also, sorry, there's also this app right here, which also addresses the clothing and the garment industry. Pope Francis once said that our purchasing choices are not simply an economic act, but a moral one. So victims are often all around us and we don't notice them. So they can be your next door neighbor, they can be in your school, your church, they are hidden in plain sight. And so here I'll share a story with you of a girl named Mary. We have a handout on this story, or you can feel free to share one of your own stories. In this particular case, Mary came from a single family home. Her mother was working, barely making ends meet. Mary attended the local church and went to youth group there. However, Mary had also befriended an older girl. And when this older girl learned that Mary's mom could not afford to buy her school supplies until her next paycheck, she offered Mary a job at the local hotel. However, unfortunately, that was the last time that Mary saw her mom when she told her, "Hey, I've got a job. I just need to go with my friend and work at this hotel over the weekend." She was dropped off at a local hospital where she died of a drug overdose. And authorities believe it was part of a human trafficking ring where victims are often injected with drugs to make them more compliant. So let's look at some of the risk factors. So traffickers tend to prey on those who are most vulnerable. Those living in extreme poverty, maybe have lost their livelihoods due to natural disasters, are looking to belong and feel loved. They maybe are in abusive situations. Um, they're being groomed online. They're using pornography. And they're trying to escape other wars or other forms of violence. They may be migrant workers. They may lack those job opportunities, maybe don't have an education. And they're also maybe a victim of a natural disaster. So those who are looking for love and belonging, that trafficker will meet that need. If they're looking for a job or to help support their family, the trafficker will help meet that need. So one victim in Orlando finally called the National Human Trafficking Hotline during Hurricane Irma because she was afraid she was not going to meet her quota. So traffickers will usually institute a quota, $500 to $1,500 a night. If they don't meet that quota, they're not going to get food. They may not get the drugs they're addicted to, or they may not get the medication that they need. So when we see women that are actively soliciting out buyers and Johns, it is for these very reasons alone. So oftentimes victims are experiencing an extreme sense of hopelessness, right? So once again, we see some of the same factors, that low self-esteem. Maybe they're unsupervised, they're lonely, weak support structures that need to belong and be loved. So one former player's client once said, "You will do anything to feel like his everything, and he promises you everything. And the things he asks you to do, they don't seem that bad after all. If you get what you've always wanted your whole life, love. And as long as your profits meet expectations, you will get that love that you always desired." So are we giving our kids the love and attention that we deserve? I often ask that question, especially if we're presenting to parents as well. So many victims come from abusive families. A lot of victims, most of the victims that are child victims are coming from foster care. They also may be from divorced families, a single family home. And so I'll share another story of a girl who was 10 years old. Her parents had recently been divorced. Her mom was working, but there was a 10-year-old boy who came and started being her friend, would help her with her homework, would bring her snacks. So one day when he said, let's go to the local convenience store, she didn't hesitate. And when a car pulled up beside them and he told her to get in, she didn't question him. She trusted him. Unfortunately, she was injected with heroin and she was trafficked up and down the I-4 corridor for the next 7 years. While traffickers will target those who are most vulnerable, they do not discriminate. As we mentioned, they can be victims from wealthy families, all races, foreign, domestic, men, girls, yes, and boys are victims as well. So while girls may be trafficked, oftentimes because of that intimate partner, that Romeo pimp or Romeo trafficker, boys are often trafficked through what is called survival sex. So when you have someone who's been runs away from their home or has been kicked out of their home and known as a throwaway because of the way they identify as either gay, bisexual, or transgender, what we don't always realize is that, once again, if they're under the age of 18 and they're trading sexual acts for shelter, for food, sometimes even drugs, they are automatically considered a victim of human trafficking. This can also happen to boys through gaming and social media as well. So I will share another story of a boy named Leo. Now, Leo was 16 years old when he was groomed and trafficked through what seemed like an innocent online gaming system, one that millions of children use around the country. He wanted to connect with other people, and his parents thought it was a great idea for him to make some friends. So when Leo finally decided to meet up with his online friends, what he found after he traveled across state lines were 7 grown men. They had taken him, kept him trapped in a filthy trailer where he was forced to perform sex acts for a year. During that time, these same men were grooming and trying to lure another 17-year-old boy. It was only then that Leo was then released from his prison, but his life had been forever scarred. And so that we see this happening often with teenage boys who are maybe even wanting something as simple as a puppy. They will sell you the dream. This happened to a boy here in Marion County who just always wanted a puppy. And so in another landmark case that involved 2 boys, 13-year-old boys here in Central Florida, they sent illicit photos to someone who they thought was a girl at their school. Once they sent those photos, then they used that as blackmail to send more photos and videos. Those photos and videos were later posted on Twitter without their permission. The mother had contacted Twitter once one of the boys became suicidal, and she had told them, you need to take this down. My son did not consent for this to be posted. Twitter refused. It was only when law enforcement got involved that they finally took down those photos and videos. By then, they had been viewed 167,000 times. The case against Twitter is still ongoing, which is now known as X. So what do the traffickers look like? So here you might ask the audience who they think on here is a trafficker. Most of them actually get it right, right? There's usually at least one person that says all of them, and they would be correct. So traffickers not only can be the perpetrators, the ones selling them, but also buying. So here we have a judge, we have a friend, a teacher, a politician, a religious leader, a celebrity. She was in Smallville. We also have a little breakdown of each of these cases as well. A family, this grandmother was selling her 13-year-old granddaughter to her boyfriend. Law enforcement, And yes, once again, statistics vary, but anywhere from 26 to 47% of trafficked children are sold by a parent, legal guardian, or relative, depending on what part of the country that you are looking at. So just like the victims, they can be young, they can be old, they can be someone that you already know, they can be another student. For $9.95, you can go on Amazon and purchase a book, Pimpology, The 48 Laws of Pimping, written by a pimp for a pimp. So one particular high school or middle school student was actually pimping out two 12-year-old girls in his middle school, and he had this book on him. The traffickers will actually use Maslow's hierarchy of needs to train other traffickers on how to target and manipulate their victims. So with this video here, it gives an example of some of the different victims that we may see and the different ways that they were targeted based on their needs. So you may have those physiological needs, food, shelter, then you're looking at higher up the pyramid and love, belonging, or maybe they have low self-esteem. So they will manipulate their victims in a grooming process. So they're meeting either that physiological needs of that food and shelter, or taking them in shopping sprees and introducing them to drugs. When I did a presentation with Catholic Charities, I had a grandmother come up to me and she said her daughter was targeted because she had low self-esteem. She was targeted by another boy in her high school. And this boy was addicted to drugs and had turned to trafficking as a way to support his drug habit. So this grandmother had told me I had never thought that this could happen to the all-American family. Because of our limited time, I didn't include Carly Church's TED Talk, but I do encourage people to go and watch her TED Talk on domestic sex trafficking, because she just does a tremendous job of really breaking down that grooming stages. So it begins with that luring stage, and they sell you your dream. They start to make you feel so special. They ask you questions, and no one has ever paid that much attention to you. Then becomes that grooming and that gaming stage, right? So then they begin to wine you and dine you. They may buy you things or even sometimes drugs. And then they will emotionally abuse and manipulate their victims into the life. So then he would later use her dreams that he found out in the very beginning of that luring stage, then to sell her very dream to do what he wants her to do. And she will then do the one thing she never thought she would do, and that's to sell herself. So where do traffickers prey? This is a video of a girl who met someone online and her story on how she was trafficked. So traffickers will tend to prey in areas where kids hang out. It could be a mall, it could be attractions, playgrounds, restaurants and coffee shops, movie theaters, nightclubs, schools and college campuses, sporting events. And so what happens is that traffickers will may hang out at a mall, and they'll target a group of girls or maybe a girl that's by herself, and they know within 30 seconds of speaking with someone if that's someone they can someone can manipulate or not. So if he goes up to a girl and he says, "Wow, you have really pretty eyes," and she looks at him and says, "Thank you," he knows he can move right along. Now, if he goes up to a girl and he says, "Wow, your eyes are so beautiful," and she looks down and says, "No, they're not," then he knows he has her. Sporting events. During the Super Bowl, there's often a large amount of girls and events where they're advertised and sold. During one sting operation during the Super Bowl, a 15-year-old boy took an Uber to buy sex in response to an ad. And he admitted he was watching so much porn, it just wasn't enough anymore. Natural disasters are another place that traffickers will go to target people. So this happened with Hurricane Dorian when it hit the Bahamas. And what we saw here in Central Florida was that victims of this storm, of this hurricane, were being lured here to Florida with the promise of a certain job. So much so that they could even bring their families and have a place to stay. So what happened was that once they got here, of course, those promises turned out to be very different than what they thought. And in one particular case, there was even a GoFundMe account that was set up in the name of these victims, and then the trafficker kept all of the money. And then we see that the internet is really where most of the traffickers are hanging out now, because they can target and reach so many more kids than they can in person. So let's look at some of the psychology for online grooming that we may see with trafficking. So traffickers are scrolling the internet and chat rooms and in game rooms and so forth, looking for those youth who are not happy at home. Maybe they got in some bad grades. They're looking for love, for connection. And of course, that's where that grooming process, and they tell them exactly what they want to hear. So I'll share a particular story of a teenage daughter who was fighting with her mom. She was tired of her mom telling her to do the dishes, do the dishes. And so she went and posted online, I hate my mom. So within 20 minutes, a 19-year-old girl said, oh, I totally get it. My mom's the same way. Hey, do you want to go to a party? Within an hour, she was picked up, taken to a local motel, and introduced to that girl's boyfriend, who then told her, you're going to have to start selling yourself for sex. When she refused, she was knocked out and tied up to a bed, where she was then raped. So in 2004, 85% of victims who met their traffickers online eventually met them in person. But we've been educating our kids. Our kids are learning to be a little bit more savvy online. So then we fast forward to 2018. And according to Thorne, 58% of traffickers who first met their victims online eventually convinced them to meet them in person. So today, we see those numbers are going down a little bit. 42% of victims who initially met their traffickers online still never met their trafficker in person, but were still trafficked. So how do you think that can happen? So once again, through the grooming process, traffickers will target our teens, boys and girls, to send photos to sextort them. Sexting has been used as a tool by traffickers to entrap girls through blackmail, saying they'll send their pictures to their family members and their friends if they don't cooperate with what they're doing. So in one particular case, a girl who sent a nude photo to someone she had met online was blackmailed, and he told her that he was going to have an Uber come and pick her up at her house, take her to the local hotel. This is what she was expected to do. And then he would have an Uber waiting for her to take her right back home. She never even has to meet her trafficker. Sextortion has been huge. We've got people from other countries targeting our boys, getting them to send them photos and videos, asking them to wipe out their entire savings account, and then asking them to kill themselves afterwards. And in some cases, unfortunately, this is what is happening. I do want to mention, because we often don't hear about this, but pornography also plays a role with sex trafficking. According to the US Institute Against Human Trafficking, it is the #1 fueling factor to human trafficking. It is used as a grooming tactic, and traffickers will use it for the victims to show what they're expected to perform, or by Johns or the buyers. It's also driving the demand. And then about half of the pornographic videos that are out there are actually made of sex trafficked victims. Studies have shown that it is easier to recover from an addiction to cocaine than it is to recover from an addiction to pornography. So in one particular webinar that I attended, talked about the demand side. And someone who works with the buyers found that every single buyer that he worked with had become addicted to pornography. So there are hundreds of apps out there that traffickers will use to target our children and teens. So they may play a game with them or become their friend. They, of course, pose to be, maybe another young person to gain their trust. This is happening on Roblox and Clash of Clans, Discord and WhatsApp. Snapchat is known for teens sending new photos, thinking they're going to disappear, but you can still screenshot those images. And TikTok is another app where anyone can make comments, access your full personal information. And then Fortnite was another game where boys were trading photos, explicit photos of themselves for game currency known as V-Bucks. So the point is not to go into each of these apps, but just to kind of raise that awareness. We have a whole separate presentation just for parents alone on some of internet safety and social media and so forth. So it's important to understand why victims stay. So if they're not shackled, they're not tied up in a room somewhere with bars, why do victims just not run away? So what we see is a bond, a trauma bond, something also known as Stockholm syndrome. And we see this a lot with some of the younger victims of trafficking. So they are called Romeo traffickers or the boyfriend pimp. And even when here locally, when some of these girls are rescued from their trafficking situation, they will run right back to their trafficker. And it's because they think that they're in love with them. They have been manipulated to the point where they don't understand that they're a victim of trafficking. They think that they're choosing this, and they think that their trafficker actually loves and cares about them because they're the only ones that have ever showed them any type of love or kindness. So oftentimes, they also lack understanding of their situation. Most, if not all, victims of human trafficking don't self-identify as a victim of human trafficking. And then they may also feel helpless and afraid. Once again, those threats to themselves, to their family, to their friends. And there are some that have what is known as the guerrilla trafficker. So the guerrilla trafficker will beat them, starve them, drug them, brainwash them, or even worse. One thing I also want to mention is what is called the CEO pimp, which convinces people to do a job opportunity which will financially benefit them, and the victims are often impoverished or looking to better their lives or opportunity. Online job postings, seemingly legitimate hiring agencies for careers, have postings for restaurants, construction, domestic work, and more. I know in one particular case that we saw here in Florida, there was an advertisement in a Catholic newspaper. So the person who responded to that ad thought, since it's in a Catholic newspaper, it must be legitimate. So this can happen with both victims of sex and labor trafficking. There have been many cases of healthcare workers promised jobs in the United States and then trafficked and forced to work as healthcare workers. So this reminds us that it can really happen to anyone. It doesn't matter your education or social status. So labor trafficking victims can not only be found among patients in healthcare settings, but also the healthcare workers in residential care facilities, occupational therapy, in-home caregiving. Foreign victims are often tricked with misleading visa contracts, indebted, and threatened if they speak up. So now let's look at some of the possible victim signs. If they're a student, they may have declining grades, inconsistent stories, frequent school absences. One particular survivor here in Central Florida who was trafficked by her own mother said she was often absent from school and even went as far as to ask for detention because she didn't want to go home. But no one in her school ever asked her why. They may be drugged and disoriented, have excessive cash or no cash at all. They may have new and expensive clothes and accessories. So do you know someone who's coming from a lower income family? All of a sudden, they've got the latest designer shoes, purses, new cell phones, so forth. That is all part of the grooming process. They may have a much older boyfriend or girlfriend. And then obviously you want to look for injuries and signs of abuse. You also want to look for changes in character. Was someone once outgoing and now they seem very subdued? They don't seem very friendly or anymore like they once were. Or it could be the other way around. So you want to look for those changes in character. Branding and jewelry, tattoos. Traffickers will often brand their victims with a tattoo because this is the way they send a message to other pimps or traffickers that this girl belongs to me, because they see them as their property, not as a human being. And are they very fearful, submissive, shy? They don't want to talk. And maybe they have someone talking for them or answering questions for them. What are their working and living conditions like? Do they appear to have been deprived of food or medical care, water, sleep? And some of these indicators may not always mean that someone is being trafficked, but it may mean that they're being abused or may need services still. So William Wilberforce, who was instrumental in ending and abolishing slavery in England during the transatlantic slave trade, once said, "You may choose to look the other way, but never again can you say that you did not know." So at this point, I encourage people to put this phone number into their phones, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. An easy way to remember it is 888-3737, 888. You can remain anonymous if you choose, or you can also call 911 if it's an emergency or you see a trafficking situation happening at that moment. You can also text info or help to be free. And there's also a cybertipline.org or 1-800-THE-LOST. Here, I would encourage people to get involved with the Alliance to End Human Trafficking. They can become a member and then they can join one of our working groups. They can follow us on social media. They can become a conscious consumer, prayerfully support our work, and they can also get involved with their community, maybe volunteering with some of the local organizations where they live that may help survivors. And then I'd like to leave people with this quote. And for those who may not realize that Pope Francis himself often speaks against this affront to human dignity, he actually rescued 80 girls in Buenos Aires, Argentina from a trafficking situation and risked his own life. You could also, if your audience is not Catholic, also share a quote by Benjamin Franklin, who once said that justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time viewing our webinar, and we hope that you will go on to the next steps of our training to learn how to be a better trainer, as well as some Catholic social teaching and more about our organization. Have a great day.